A successful CEO, admired by many, took in 4 children no one else wanted. But as years passed, his decision led to unexpected consequences. These children weren't just looking for a family, they were looking for a chance to rewrite their futures. But what happens when the truth behind their adoption begins to unravel? David never thought the very lives he tried to save might end up breaking him in ways he never imagined. If you've ever wondered how the choices we make shape our futures, stay with us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. This story has much more to reveal. Your support means everything. David Harrison, CEO of Harrison Enterprises, had never been one to indulge in charity work. He was a man of power, a man of business, where time meant money, and every second had a price. But on that particular day, he found himself attending a charity event at Willowbrook Orphanage, a place he had never heard of before, yet a place that seemed to beckon him with an unusual force. He had always prided himself on keeping his personal life separate from his work, but something about this event felt different. Perhaps it was the cause, or perhaps it was the unexpected nature of the situation. But the moment he entered the orphanage, he felt an unfamiliar sense of unease mixed with intrigue. The room was full of children, each with their own story, but as David's eyes scanned the faces, 4 children stood out to him: Megan, Joshua, Lily, and Noah. They were seated together in the corner, quietly observing the room. There was something about them, something unsettling. Their eyes, though filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity, seemed distant, as if they were not truly there in the room with everyone else. Megan's eyes were the deepest brown, yet there was a hollowness to them. Joshua, sitting beside her, was more lively, but had an air of caution about him, as though he had learned long ago not to trust easily. Lily, the youngest, had a softness about her, yet her small frame seemed to carry the weight of the world. Noah, standing beside them, was the tallest, and there was an odd solemnity in his stance, as though the years had aged him far beyond his 12 years. David felt a strange tug in his chest, an inexplicable connection that pulled him toward them. He couldn't explain it. He had never been one for emotional outbursts, but something about these 4 children, their eyes, their quiet resilience, stirred something within him. As he walked across the room, his gaze never left them. When he reached their table, Megan, the eldest, looked up at him and smiled shyly, a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. There was no immediate reason for David to feel this connection. He had no children of his own, and his life was more about mergers, negotiations, and boardrooms than about nurturing or caregiving. Yet, in that moment, standing before these children, he felt an unexpected pull, as though he had known them for a lifetime. It was as though they weren't strangers to him, but rather a part of a story he hadn't yet figured out. David leaned down, offering a gentle smile. "Hello," he said softly. Megan's eyes seemed to soften at the sound of his voice. The others didn't speak, but they didn't look away either. There was a silent acknowledgement between them, a momentary bond. It was more than mere politeness. It was something deeper. For a moment, David forgot about the event, the other people in the room, and the expectations placed upon him. All that mattered was the quiet connection he had just shared with these children. As the event went on, David found himself distracted. He wasn't paying attention to the speeches or the donations being made. His thoughts kept drifting back to the children. Why did they feel so familiar? Why did he feel a responsibility to them, even though they weren't his? Was it the simple fact that they were orphans, without parents, without a home? Or was it something more? He couldn't put his finger on it. But as the day drew to a close, he knew one thing for sure: he wanted to change their lives. He wanted to be the one to offer them a chance, a family, a future. As the children left the room, David stood frozen, watching them walk away. They turned a corner and disappeared from view. And yet, the feeling stayed with him. The pull, the connection, was undeniable. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, and as he walked toward the exit, he found himself asking the same question over and over again. Could he really change their lives? Could he really take them in and offer them a future they had never known? He stopped in his tracks, the doubt creeping in. What if they don't want my help? What if I'm just another rich man trying to do something good for his image? Yet, deep down, he knew that wasn't the reason. It wasn't about him or his image. It was about giving these children a chance, a life they could call their own. David Harrison wasn't just a businessman. Today, for the first time in years, he felt like a man with a purpose. David stood by the door for a moment, looking back over his shoulder. He couldn't see them anymore, but the feeling was still there. It was as if a door had opened inside him, and he was unsure whether he could ever shut it again. Could he really do it? The question lingered, unanswered. David sat in his sleek office at Harrison Enterprises, the hum of the city outside barely reaching him through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His thoughts drifted from the important meeting he had just concluded to the faces of 4 children he had met at the Willowbrook orphanage. He had come to the event thinking it would be a routine charity appearance, a few speeches, a few handshakes, nothing more. But as he had locked eyes with Megan, Joshua, Lily, and Noah, something inside him had shifted. At first, he had dismissed it as a fleeting moment of empathy, nothing worth dwelling on. After all, he had built his life on more important things: his company, his wealth, his reputation. These were the things that mattered, the things that filled the void in his heart. Yet, as he sat at his desk, staring blankly at the numbers on the screen, the image of the 4 children wouldn't leave him. Megan's wide brown eyes, Joshua's quiet curiosity, Lily's innocence, and Noah's solemn silence. They haunted him. He shifted in his chair, trying to refocus on his work, but his mind kept circling back to the orphanage. He had spent years filling his life with achievements, trophies, and accolades, but there was always a hollowness, a sense that something was missing. Could it be that these children, these strangers, held the key to what he had been searching for all along? The thought unsettled him. He had never been one to entertain feelings of guilt or the need for redemption. But here he was, a man of power and privilege, questioning everything he had built. He couldn't deny the connection he had felt with those children, an inexplicable bond that had tugged at him since the moment he laid eyes on them. His rational mind told him to dismiss it, to move on, to focus on what he knew best. But his heart, unaccustomed to such emotions, refused to let go. Meanwhile, at Willowbrook, the children carried on with their quiet lives, unaware of the man who had unknowingly made a place for himself in their hearts. They had no idea how deeply their brief encounter with David Harrison had affected him. For them, life continued in its usual rhythm: meals, school, and waiting for the next visitor, the next stranger to come and leave. But for Megan, something had shifted too. She couldn't shake the image of David from her mind. She had seen men like him before, men who came and went, who promised change but rarely delivered. Yet, there was something different about him. She couldn't put her finger on it, but when he had looked at her, it felt like he had seen her, truly seen her, in a way no one else had. It made her feel important, if only for a fleeting moment. It made her wonder if she could ever have a family, a place where she wasn't just another face in a crowd. Back in his office, David sat with his head in his hands, trying to push the thoughts away. He had been through his share of hard times, but the struggles of running a company and building an empire were nothing compared to what these children had experienced. And yet, their lives so far removed from his somehow felt more meaningful, more urgent. What did it mean to have everything and yet feel empty? What did it mean to have power, but not the love of those around you? Was it too late for him to change? Could he, a man who had lived a life of control and order, truly open his heart to these 4 children and make them a part of his world? His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him out of his thoughts. The screen flashed with a notification from Willowbrook Orphanage. "We would be honored if you could join us for another charity event next month. We are hoping to see you there, as the children still talk about your visit." The words hit him like a punch in the gut. He hadn't expected it. In fact, he hadn't even considered that they would want him to come back. But now, the thought of seeing those children again made his heart race. There was no reason to go, no business incentive, no clear reason for him to show up. And yet, He couldn't ignore the pull. He picked up his phone and typed a quick reply. Something simple, something professional. I would be happy to attend. I'll be there. He hit send. And just like that, the decision was made. He didn't know why he had agreed to go. But in that moment, he knew that it wasn't just another charity event. It was the beginning of something he hadn't yet understood. Something that was going to change everything. As he leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, the weight of his decision settled in. There was no turning back now. He had made the choice. He would go. And when he saw them again, he would have to confront whatever it was inside of him that had been awakened by their presence. He couldn't ignore it any longer. David stood at the back of the room, his eyes scanning the faces in front of him. It was supposed to be just another event, a gathering of influential donors, a display of his charity efforts to better the community. The children from Willowbrook Orphanage, the ones he had met just a few weeks ago, were sitting at the front, awaiting their turn to speak. Megan, Joshua, Lily, and Noah, each of them with their own story, their own silent burdens. David knew their stories. He knew what they had been through, but standing there now, watching them, he felt a sense of disconnect. They were so different from him. He was a man of power, wealth, and influence. They were simply children, abandoned by society, struggling for a chance at life. There was no comparison, and yet, something about them, something about their presence, kept tugging at him. As the meeting began, David tried to focus on the speeches. He listened to the representatives from various organizations, their words meant to inspire, to give hope. But his attention kept drifting back to the 4 children. His mind wandered back to the moments he had spent with them, the way Megan's eyes had searched his face for reassurance, the way Noah had spoken so little, as if each word he uttered weighed more than it should. There was a connection there, something David couldn't ignore. It wasn't a physical connection. It was something deeper, something intangible. It was as though their lives had become intertwined with his, though they didn't even realize it. He couldn't explain it. How could he, a man who had spent his life building a business empire, have this deep yearning to be part of their world? It made no sense, and yet, here he was, unable to focus on anything but the thought of them. Megan stood up to speak, her voice trembling slightly as she addressed the audience. David noticed the way she held herself, her posture betraying a confidence that didn't quite match her words. There was something about her, something he couldn't put into words. As she spoke, her eyes flickered toward David, catching his gaze for just a moment before quickly looking away. "Thank you for helping us," Megan said quietly. "We may not have families, but we know that there are people who care, and that's enough." Her words were simple, but there was something in the way she said them that stuck with David. He could see the weight behind them, the longing for something more, something he couldn't quite place. She wasn't just thanking them for the charity, for the money or the resources. She was thanking them for the acknowledgement, for the recognition that they were worthy of love and care. And in that moment, David realized something about himself. He had spent so much time focusing on the things that didn't matter: money, success, power, that he had forgotten what it truly meant to care about someone else, to truly give without expecting anything in return. After the speech, the children were seated again. David felt an urge to approach them, to speak to them, but something held him back. He wasn't sure what it was. It wasn't fear, but it was something else, an understanding that he didn't belong in their world, that he wasn't sure he knew how to be part of it. He was an outsider, a stranger in their lives, and yet a part of him longed to bridge that gap, to do something meaningful, something more than just write a check or show up for a photo op. Just as he was about to turn away, he heard Megan's voice again, this time quieter, more personal. "Mr. Harrison," she said, catching his attention. David turned back toward her, his heart skipping a beat. She was looking at him with that same searching gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and something else, uncertainty. "Perhaps—" "Are you okay?" Megan asked, her voice barely audible, David blinked, caught off guard by the question. She had asked it so matter-of-factly, as if she already knew the answer, as if she had been observing him as much as he had been observing her. He didn't know how to respond at first. He wasn't used to being questioned like this. Not in this way. Not by someone so young. Someone who had seen far too much pain for her age. "I'm fine," David replied after a moment, his voice betraying a hint of hesitation. "Just thinking. Thinking about what Megan pressed, her tone curious, but not prying." David looked at her, studying her face. She wasn't just some child at an orphanage. She was someone who had experienced loss, hardship, and rejection. But she wasn't broken. She was strong. And in that moment, David saw something in her that he hadn't seen in years, a sense of hope, a belief that things could be different, that they could be better. He had lost that belief long ago, buried under years of ambition and self-preservation. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "I was just thinking about how much you all deserve a chance, a real chance," he said, his voice soft but steady. He didn't know why he said it, but the words felt right. It wasn't just about charity or pity. It was about something deeper, about acknowledging their humanity, their worth. And I think I can help with that. Megan's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of hope in them that made David's heart ache. She didn't respond right away, but her silence spoke volumes. She looked at him for a moment longer, as if trying to decide if she believed him. "I'll be back," David added, more to himself than to her, his voice firm with newfound conviction. "I promise." As the event continued, David couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. He had promised them something, something that would change everything. And he wasn't sure yet what that meant, but he knew that he couldn't back down. He couldn't walk away. David made his way to the exit, his mind racing with thoughts of what he had just said, what he had just promised. As he stepped outside into the cool air of the evening, he felt a sense of unease settle over him. He didn't know how to keep his promise. He didn't know how to make their lives better, but he knew he had to try. And as he drove back to his office, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something inside him had shifted, though he wasn't sure what it was. David sat in the quiet of his office, the city's hum barely reaching him through the thick glass windows. It was a familiar setting, one that he had grown accustomed to over the years, the cold, calculated rhythm of business, the endless stream of meetings and deals. But today, something had shifted. It wasn't the numbers or the power plays. It was the 4 children, Megan, Joshua, Lily, and Noah. The more he thought about them, the more his mind wandered. He had promised himself that he wouldn't let them get too close. He couldn't afford to get emotionally entangled with a group of orphans. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw them. Every time he tried to focus on something else, their faces came to mind, their eyes filled with the kind of quiet resilience that made his chest tighten. It had all started with that simple visit to Willowbrook Orphanage. He had been there on business, just another charitable event, a public appearance to bolster his reputation, but the moment he met them, it had felt different. They weren't just children, they were a puzzle, pieces of a story that David hadn't yet understood. It was Noah, in particular, who had left him unsettled. He was the quiet one, the one who said the least. Yet there was something about him that seemed so familiar. David couldn't quite place it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he knew this child somehow. The connection wasn't immediate. It wasn't like he had seen Noah before, but it was there, like a forgotten memory, buried deep within him. David leaned back in his chair, the words of the past week running through his mind. He had tried to dismiss it, to convince himself that it was nothing more than his usual overactive imagination. But he couldn't stop thinking about Noah. He had seen something in the boy's eyes that made him question everything he thought he knew about his own life. There was a certain quiet strength in Noah, a calmness that reminded David of someone from his past. As the memory surfaced, David froze. His heart skipped a beat. Sophie Turner. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Sophie, the woman he had loved all those years ago, the woman who had disappeared without a trace. The memories of their time together were like fragments of a dream, vivid but fleeting. He hadn't thought about Sophie in years, not since she had walked out of his life without so much as a goodbye. It had been a young love, intense and real. But when she vanished, it left a hole in his heart that had never quite healed. He had spent so many years trying to forget, trying to move forward. But now, as he sat in his office, everything came flooding back. Noah's eyes, the way he held himself, the sadness in his expression, it all reminded David of Sophie. There was something about the way the boy carried himself, a mixture of quiet strength and vulnerability, that was so reminiscent of her. But it couldn't be. It was impossible. Sophie had disappeared. She had no children, no family to speak of. She was gone, and that was all David had ever known. But still, the more he thought about it, the more the connection seemed undeniable. The way Noah's gaze met his, the way his silence echoed the feelings David had once shared with Sophie. David couldn't ignore it. It was like a puzzle piece that didn't fit, but he could feel it, could sense that it was there, waiting to be placed. David stood up from his desk, pacing back and forth in the quiet of the room. He tried to shake the thought from his mind, but it wouldn't leave him. Sophie was gone, and Noah was just a child from an orphanage. There was no connection, he was simply reading too much into it. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself otherwise, the feeling lingered. Megan, Joshua, Lily, Noah. He murmured, repeating their names to himself. The names echoed in the empty room, each one standing out in his mind like a beacon. Suddenly, it hit him. There was a possibility he couldn't ignore, a possibility that felt both terrifying and undeniable. Could it be that Noah was his child? Could he be the son of Sophie Turner, a child she had kept secret from him all these years? David clenched his fists at his sides. He hadn't thought about Sophie in so long. He had buried her memory deep within himself, locked it away in the corners of his mind. But now, with Noah's image so fresh in his thoughts, it felt like Sophie had returned, like she had come back to him in the form of this quiet, lost child. It wasn't just a chance encounter, it was something deeper, something that David couldn't explain. But there it was. David's heart raced as he stood in the middle of his office, the weight of the realization pressing down on him. The idea of Noah being his son was unthinkable, yet somehow, it felt like the only thing that made sense. He couldn't keep running from this. He couldn't ignore the connection, no matter how much it scared him. But what if he was wrong? What if he was simply projecting his own fears and desires onto a child who had nothing to do with his past? What if he was seeing something that wasn't there? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but deep down, David knew that he had to find out the truth. He had to know. His mind raced with questions, his thoughts spiraling in all directions. How could he even begin to ask Sophie about this? How could he find out if Noah was his son without opening up old wounds, without digging into a past that he had tried so hard to forget? And if Noah was his son, what did that mean for him, for his life, for the future he had so carefully built? David sank back into his chair, his hands running through his hair in frustration. He felt lost, caught between the past and the present, unable to move forward. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear he had to do something about it. He couldn't just sit back and wonder. He had to find the truth, no matter the cost. But even as he made that decision, a sense of dread settled in his stomach. What would he do if it was true? What would he do if Noah really was his son? And why had Sophie kept this from him for so long? David couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something he wasn't ready to face. But the pull to know the truth was too strong. It was something he couldn't ignore. He stood up, walking to the window and staring out at the city below. The world outside seemed so vast, so full of possibilities. But here, in the quiet of his office, everything felt uncertain. David Harrison, the man who had built an empire, felt small. He couldn't ignore the truth any longer. David had always considered himself a man of control, a man who kept his emotions locked away beneath a carefully constructed facade. His wealth, his empire, his success. These were the things that defined him. Emotions were something he rarely allowed himself to feel, let alone confront. But as he sat across from Noah, watching the boy fidget nervously with the sleeve of his shirt, David couldn't help but feel a deep stir within him. It was a familiar discomfort, the kind of feeling that signaled something important was about to surface. Noah was quiet, the words that David wanted to hear never coming. It had been a week since their last meeting at the charity event, but nothing had felt the same since. David's thoughts kept circling back to the children, especially Noah. His instinct told him there was something more to this child than met the eye, something hidden in the silence Noah carried with him. David shifted in his chair, his hands pressed firmly on the table. "Noah," he began, his voice tentative. "Tell me, what was life like before you came to Willowbrook?" Noah's eyes flickered toward him, but there was hesitation in the boy's gaze. He looked down at his hands, and then out the window, as if searching for the right words, or perhaps the courage to speak them. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, and David found himself leaning in, waiting for an answer that might change everything. I don't remember much," Noah said quietly, his voice a little shaky. "But I know it wasn't good. My mom, she tried. She really tried. But things just broke." David felt his heart tighten. The way Noah spoke softly, with the faintest tremor in his voice, made David realize that whatever had happened, it had scarred the boy deeply. There was something about Noah's tone, something in the way he spoke of his mother, that hinted at a story much darker than David could have imagined. "She left you?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Noah nodded, his lips pressed together in a tight line. He didn't speak for a moment, and in that silence, David could hear the weight of the words that weren't said. Noah's mother had abandoned him, but the boy was still holding on to something, some piece of hope or love that had once been there. David couldn't quite figure out what it was, but he could see it in Noah's eyes. "Do you know where she went?" David pressed, trying to piece together the puzzle that Noah was clearly struggling to understand himself. Noah's eyes flickered again, and for a brief moment, David thought the boy might not answer. But then, in a quiet voice that seemed to come from somewhere deep within, Noah spoke again. "She left because she had to. She loved me, but she couldn't keep me." The words felt heavy, like an old wound that had never fully healed. David's heart clenched in his chest. What had happened to Sophie, and why hadn't he known about any of this? He had loved her once, long ago, but their lives had drifted apart after everything had gone wrong. They had both moved on, or so he thought. But hearing Noah speak about his mother, something clicked. Sophie hadn't disappeared because she didn't care. She had left because there had been no other choice. David leaned back in his chair, stunned. He could barely comprehend what Noah was saying. The words felt like a betrayal of sorts, a truth he had never been prepared for. But then Noah's next words hit David like a lightning bolt. "She said my dad. He wasn't there for us," Noah murmured, his voice barely audible. "She said he didn't know about me. Or about us. She didn't want him to know. She didn't think he'd ever care." David felt a sharp pain pierce his chest, as if someone had just driven a knife into the very heart of his being. It was as though the world had gone still, and he could hear nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat, slow and deliberate. Could it be, was this boy, this quiet, troubled child sitting in front of him, actually his son? David's mind raced. Sophie's words echoed in his ears. "My dad." It was the phrase that haunted him now, more than anything. Sophie had been the love of his life, the woman who had left without warning, leaving him with nothing but questions and a broken heart. But now, as he sat there, listening to Noah, everything he had known, everything he had assumed, seemed to be slipping away. David tried to gather his thoughts, tried to hold on to some semblance of composure, he had to ask, had to know, "Noah, are you saying that I could be your father?" Noah's eyes shifted away from his gaze, and for a moment, the room felt too small, too confining. Noah's response was a hesitant nod, and David's breath caught in his throat. The truth had come crashing down like a wave, too powerful for David to stop, too overwhelming to fully comprehend. Sophie had never told him she had a child, let alone 4 children. But if Noah was his son, what did that mean for the others? What did it mean for his own life, his carefully controlled world? David's mind raced with questions, with confusion and disbelief. But one thing was clear: he couldn't ignore this anymore. He had to find out the truth, no matter how painful or complicated it might be. As he sat there, the weight of Noah's words pressing on him, David realized that everything in his life had just changed. He was no longer the same man who had walked into that orphanage just weeks ago. This wasn't just about charity or goodwill anymore. This was about family, his family, and it was something he had never expected to confront. But now, he couldn't turn away. He had to know the truth. And if these children were his, he had to do whatever it took to be a part of their lives. He couldn't leave them behind, not now that he knew they were connected to him in ways he hadn't yet understood. David stood up from the table, feeling the weight of his decision. He had no idea how to move forward, but one thing was certain: he would find out the truth, no matter the cost. And when he did, everything in his life would change. The letter sat on David's desk, an old, faded envelope with his name scribbled on the front in a handwriting he hadn't seen in years. It was from Thomas Mitchell, an old friend from college, someone who had known about Sophie and the love they once shared. Thomas had been there when Sophie and David were inseparable, the one person who had known the depth of their relationship. But after Sophie left, Thomas had been one of the few who kept in touch with David, even though the bond between them had frayed over time. David hadn't heard from Thomas in over a decade. But today, the unexpected letter arrived, slipping into his life like a long-forgotten ghost, stirring memories he wasn't ready to face. The letter had been a long time coming. He could feel it in his bones. The moment he opened it, the words seemed to leap off the page, more like an accusation than a confession. Thomas spoke of Sophie in the present tense, as if she had never left, recounting details of their last few months together before her abrupt disappearance. But it wasn't just about Sophie. It was about the children, the 4 children who had come into David's life only recently. Children David had promised himself not to get attached to. Yet here he was, unable to escape their hold. David's heart raced as he read on. Sophie had kept a secret from him, something he never would have imagined. She hadn't just left him for reasons he could accept. She had left because she had given birth to his children, 4 of them, the children he had met at the orphanage. He couldn't believe it. It felt like the earth had shifted beneath his feet, like everything he knew about his past and his future had been thrown into chaos. Thomas's words were blunt, almost harsh in their clarity. Sophie had been pregnant when she disappeared. She gave birth to 4 children, but she never told you, David. She thought it was for the best. She didn't want you to know, and she never meant for you to find out this way. David's hands shook as he held the letter. Sophie, his Sophie, had given him a family, and he hadn't even known about it. He hadn't been there when they were born, hadn't been there to protect them, to love them. He had spent years grieving her loss, but now he felt like the loss was only just beginning. The weight of the secret the children who had been kept from him crushed him. David had always prided himself on being a man of control. His life was built on strategy, on decisions made with logic and precision. But this was something he couldn't control. He felt completely undone, exposed in a way that terrified him. How could Sophie have kept something so important from him? How could she have made that decision without ever telling him the truth? And how could he face these children, knowing they were his own, knowing he had missed years of their lives? He stood up from his desk, pacing the room as he tried to make sense of it all. He had lived for so long without thinking about the past, but now it was inescapable. These children were his. Megan, Joshua, Lily, and Noah, they were his flesh and blood, and Sophie had kept them from him. David's thoughts churned, each one more painful than the last. He had been given a second chance, a chance to be the father he never thought he would be. But how could he face them? How could he face them when the truth of who they were, who he was to them, felt so impossible? The more David thought about it, the clearer it became. He couldn't keep running from this. He couldn't keep pretending that he wasn't responsible for what had happened. He had to make things right, not just for them, but for himself. He had to find a way to heal the wounds that had been opened, to show these children that he was ready to be their father. But more than that, he had to heal the wound inside himself, the one that had been created when Sophie left, the one that had never quite closed. David took a deep breath. His mind made up. He had to tell them. He had to face the truth, even if it meant risking everything. He couldn't let them stay in the dark any longer. He had to be the father they deserved. He couldn't let the past define who he was anymore. The sound of the phone ringing broke his thoughts, and David glanced at the screen. It was the orphanage, Willowbrook, calling him. He had been expecting this call. It was time for him to face the children again, to confront the truth of who they were and what that meant for him. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he picked up the phone. David Harrison. The voice on the other end asked, "Yes," he replied, trying to steady his breath. "We're holding another event at the orphanage next week," the voice continued. "We'd love for you to come, to meet the children again. They talk about you often. I think it would mean a lot to them." David's mind raced. It was the moment he had been dreading, but it was also the moment he had been waiting for. He had no choice now. He had to go. He had to face them. He had to confront the truth that had been hidden for so long. "I'll be there," David said, his voice firm. As he hung up the phone, the weight of the decision pressed down on him. He was going to see them again. He was going to tell them the truth. Oh, but would they accept it? Would they accept him? After everything he had missed, would they see him as their father? Or would they see him as just another stranger? Someone who had failed them before they even had the chance to know him? David stood in the middle of his office, his heart beating loudly in his chest. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't even know what the future held. But he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't hide from this anymore. It was time to face the truth. It was time to become the man he was meant to be. And it all started with one decision, one choice that could change everything. He wasn't sure what would happen when he saw them again. But as he glanced at the letter from Thomas in his hand, David knew that he was about to embark on a journey that would alter the course of his life forever. David sat in the dimly lit living room, the weight of the morning's events hanging heavily in the air. Megan, Joshua, Lily, and Noah were seated around him, their faces a mixture of confusion, anger, and disbelief. He had been so sure that this moment would be a turning point, a moment when the truth would finally set things right. But as the silence stretched between them, he realized how wrong he had been. "Why didn't you tell us?" before Megan's voice broke through the stillness. Her eyes were wide, full of hurt, and David could see the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Why keep us in the dark?" David opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had been rehearsing this conversation in his head for days, but now that it was happening, nothing seemed right. How could he explain something so complex, so raw? Without making it worse, he had kept this secret for so long, thinking he was protecting them. But now it was clear that his silence had only caused more damage. "I didn't know how to tell you," David said quietly, his voice thick with regret. "I thought it would be easier if you didn't know. But I see now that it wasn't fair to you." Megan shook her head, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "Not fair. You kept us in the dark for years. You've been in our lives for how long, and you never once said anything." Joshua, who had been quiet up until now, looked down at the floor, his fingers tugging nervously at the hem of his shirt. "What does this mean?" "David, are you really our father? I don't even know what to believe anymore." David's heart sank as he saw the confusion in Joshua's eyes. He could see it in their faces. They were all struggling to process the truth, and none of them seemed to know how to handle it. Lily, who had been sitting with her arms crossed, looked like she might cry, but she stayed silent. She was the youngest, but even she could sense the weight of the conversation. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," David said, his voice breaking slightly. "I never wanted to hurt you. I wanted to be there for you. I was afraid. I was afraid of what it would mean, afraid of what it would do to your lives if I came back. I didn't know if you'd want me to be a part of your lives." Megan's eyes softened for a moment, but the anger was still there. Afraid, she repeated, almost to herself. "We're not some project, David. We're not something you can just come back to when it's convenient for you." David flinched, the words hitting him harder than he expected. "I know," he whispered. "I know, and I'm sorry." Noah, who had been eerily silent throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke up. "What are we supposed to do now?" he asked, his voice quiet but laced with fear. "What does this change? What does this even mean for us?" David looked at Noah, and for the first time, he felt like he could see the child beneath the surface. Noah had been quiet, reserved, but now David saw the deep well of pain in his eyes. It was a pain that echoed his own, a pain from years of abandonment, of not knowing where he belonged. David wanted to reach out, to tell him that he was there for him, but the words seemed so inadequate. Before he could respond, his phone rang, cutting through the tension in the room. David looked at the screen and saw the name of his office flash across it. He hesitated for a moment, torn between the two worlds. He was now straddling the world of his career and the world of his family. He knew he couldn't keep running from one to the other, but the call seemed urgent, and he could feel the pull of his responsibilities calling him back. "I'm sorry," David said, his voice barely audible as he stepped away from the table. "I have to take this." As he walked out of the room, he could hear the children's voices behind him, rising in frustration and confusion. It was as if everything was falling apart around him, and he had no idea how to stop it. He answered the call, his voice tight with the pressure of what was happening. "David Harrison." "David, it's urgent." The voice on the other end said, "There's a meeting we need you to attend. We need you here as soon as possible. The board's expecting your presence." David's mind raced. The board, the company, the responsibilities he had been putting off. He glanced back into the living room, where the children were waiting, their faces still etched with confusion and hurt. He couldn't leave them like this, but he also knew that if he didn't go now, the fallout would be worse. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, David said, his voice strained. He hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of his decision. He was torn between the family he was trying to build and the empire he had spent years creating. How had he gotten to this point? How had he let it all become so complicated? He walked back into the living room, where the children were still seated, watching him. The tension in the room was palpable. David could feel the distance growing between them with every passing second. He didn't know how to fix this. He didn't know if he could fix this. "I have to go," David said, his voice almost apologetic. "I know this isn't the right time, but I have to handle something at work. I'll be back as soon as I can." Megan stood up abruptly. "Work now. You've been avoiding us for years, and now you're going to hide behind your work again." Her voice trembled with frustration, her eyes bright with unshed tears. David's heart ached as he saw the hurt in her eyes. "I'm not hiding, Megan," he said softly. "I'm just trying to figure this out." But Megan shook her head. "We've been figuring it out on our own. We don't need you to run away again." David turned away, feeling the sting of her words more than he could admit. He needed to leave, but he couldn't shake the feeling that, by walking out the door, he was making things worse. He reached the door, but before he stepped outside, he paused. "I'll be back. We'll talk more. I promise." But Megan's voice stopped him before he could leave. "It's not enough," she said, her voice small but firm. "We're not your responsibility when it's convenient for you. We're your family." David didn't answer. He just turned, walked out the door, and left them behind. The ballroom at the Harrison Enterprises headquarters was a world David had long known, a space full of power, prestige, and the sort of elegant charm only the wealthy could afford. Tonight, it felt foreign, not just to him, but to the children who had never seen anything like it. The grand chandeliers, the polished floors, the murmurs of important conversations, all of it seemed distant, a world removed from the one they'd come from. He had hoped the event would be a success, that it would show the children a new side of life, but he hadn't anticipated the profound discomfort it would bring them. Lily was the first to speak, though only in a voice so quiet it barely cut through the hum of chatter. "It feels wrong," she whispered, her eyes scanning the room with unease. The intricate gowns, the crisp suits, the glasses of champagne, everything felt out of place for her. She was just a child, not used to such spaces, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her dress, as if she could escape into its folds. David looked at her, his heart aching for her discomfort. He wanted to explain, to make her understand that this wasn't her fault, but the words stuck in his throat. He had brought them into this world, but he had failed to prepare them for it. "Noah, are you okay?" he asked, glancing at the boy standing next to him. Noah, the quiet one, was standing with his arms crossed, his eyes darting nervously from face to face. He seemed to be shrinking into himself, as if he wanted to disappear entirely. David knew Noah's history, his hurt, the deep-seated fear of rejection that was always just under the surface. Tonight, that fear seemed to be eating him alive. I don't think I belong here," Noah muttered, not meeting David's eyes. "I don't know anyone." David could see the familiar shadows of uncertainty in the boy's gaze. It was the same look he had seen in his own eyes as a child, before he learned how to adapt to the expectations of this world, the world of wealth and power, where everyone else seemed to fit but him. "It's okay," David reassured him quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You belong wherever you want to be." But Noah didn't seem convinced. He pulled away slightly, as though afraid of getting too close to something he couldn't understand, couldn't grasp. The truth was, neither of them belonged here, not really. David, for all his wealth and success, still felt like an outsider in many ways. And these children, raised in a world of abandonment, had never known a space like this at all. Then, the tension shifted. David's gaze moved across the room and landed on Megan, who was standing near a group of well-dressed businessmen. She had been speaking with one of them, but something in the way the man was eyeing her made David's stomach churn. It was a look that seemed far too familiar, a kind of predatory, possessive stare. His eyes narrowed, his instincts kicking in. Without thinking, David moved toward them, making his way through the crowd until he was standing next to Megan. The man, noticing his approach, immediately straightened, but there was something in his expression that made David bristle. "Megan," David said, his voice firm, the protective streak inside him rising. "Let's move away from here." Megan's eyes widened slightly at the sudden intervention, but she quickly composed herself. She could feel the tension in David's posture, the protective aura around him. It made her feel safe, like he truly cared for her, something that, in her heart, she had been uncertain about for so long. The man, his expression flickering between annoyance and confusion, gave a curt nod and turned away, stepping back into the crowd. As David led Megan away, he glanced back at the children. He didn't know what he had expected, maybe for them to remain indifferent, or to keep their distance from him, unsure of his actions. But as they moved, David caught a glimpse of something different in their eyes. Lily, still quiet but visibly more at ease, was watching him closely now, her usual wariness replaced with a hint of trust. Joshua, who had been lingering near the side, caught his eye and gave him a small, hesitant smile. And Noah was looking at him too, but this time there was something more than just uncertainty. It was a flicker of something new, hope, perhaps, or even a realization. David's heart swelled in his chest. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew this was just one moment, one small act in a sea of difficult moments to come, but in that instant, he felt like he had done something right. He wasn't just a man giving these children a roof over their heads. He was showing them that they could count on him, that he was someone they could trust, someone who would protect them. He smiled at them, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. It was the first time, maybe, that he felt like a father, truly. But it wasn't enough, not yet. As they made their way to the refreshments table, mingling with a few familiar faces, David couldn't shake the feeling that things were still fragile, that despite his best efforts, there was a distance he hadn't yet crossed. There was still so much more to prove, so many layers to uncover, but for the first time in years, David didn't feel alone in this fight. But just as he was about to turn to face the children and continue their conversation, a momentary glance caught his attention from the far side of the room, a man he didn't recognize, a man with sharp eyes and a knowing smirk, watching the scene unfold from the other side. His presence was like a ripple through the air, unsettling, like something was about to shift again. David felt his stomach drop. Something was wrong. He wasn't sure why, but the nagging suspicion crept back in. This was only the beginning. He couldn't shake the feeling that the truth about him and these children would soon be exposed in ways he hadn't prepared for. He forced himself to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I can't afford to let this fall apart now, he thought, his mind racing. Not now. David Harrison sat in his office at Harrison Enterprises, the weight of the conversation he was about to have pressing down on his chest like 1,000 pounds. His thoughts were consumed by the memories of Sophie Turner, the woman he had once loved, whose name had haunted him for years. She was the reason for all of this, the reason why he had found himself in this impossible situation with the children he had come to love as his own. But the truth, he knew, could no longer remain hidden. It was time to face the reality of what had been buried for far too long. He had called a family meeting. The children, Megan, Noah, Lily, and Joshua had sat around the large oak table in the dining room of the mansion, their faces filled with a mixture of uncertainty and curiosity. They knew something was coming. The tension was thick in the air, so palpable that David could almost taste it. He looked at them, his heart heavy with guilt and love. How could he ever explain this to them? Would they hate him for not telling them the truth sooner? "There's something I need to tell you all," David began, his voice wavering just slightly. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "Something about your mother, Sophie, and about me." Noah, who had been quiet for most of the evening, shifted in his seat. "What about her?" he asked, his voice filled with suspicion. David took a deep breath. The words didn't come easily, but they needed to. She was the love of my life. Before any of you came into my world, we were very close, and then she disappeared from my life. I never knew what happened to her, but now I know. I know something that I should have told you sooner." Megan, who had been staring at her hands, looked up at David, her eyes full of both hope and fear. "What do you mean?" she asked softly, almost as though she was afraid of the answer. David looked at each of them, his gaze lingering on each child in turn, his heart breaking as the reality of his words sank in. "Sophie. She had all of you. You're my children. You're all mine," he said, his voice almost a whisper. The room fell silent. The words hung in the air, a revelation that hit harder than any of them could have imagined. Megan's mouth opened in shock, but no sound came out. Lily's hands trembled slightly in her lap. Joshua and Noah exchanged a glance, their confusion deepening. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath their feet, like their whole world was suddenly thrown into chaos. Megan was the first to speak, her voice low and almost strained. "No, that can't be right," she said, shaking her head. "You can't be our father. She never said anything about you." David's heart clenched at the pain in her voice. "I know. Sophie kept this from you. She kept it from all of us for reasons I still don't fully understand." He paused, trying to collect himself. "She was afraid of what it would mean for you, for all of you." Lily looked up at David, her eyes wide with disbelief. "But why didn't she tell us? Why didn't she say anything?" David looked at her, his mind racing as he searched for the right words. "She wanted to protect you. She thought you'd be safer without me in your life. I'm not the person she wanted you to know. She feared that you'd be caught up in this world of mine, the expectations, the pressures. She thought it was better if you never knew about me. And when she died, she left that decision in your hands." The room was silent again, the gravity of what David was saying sinking in. For a long time, no one spoke. The children were processing the information, their emotions unreadable. David watched them, his heart aching as he saw the confusion, the hurt, and the disbelief in their eyes. They were too young for this, too young to understand why Sophie had kept the truth from them. Noah, who had been staring at the floor, suddenly spoke. "So, you're our father, but why didn't you come for us? Why did you let us stay in that orphanage?" His voice was thick with emotion, a mixture of anger and pain. "Why did you leave us there?" David's throat tightened. He had no answer, not one that could make sense of all the years lost. "I wasn't ready," he said quietly. "I thought I couldn't be the man you needed. I thought I wasn't good enough. I let fear control my choices. I should have been there. I should have found you." The tears in Megan's eyes began to well up. "You abandoned us, and now you want us to just accept it," she whispered, her voice breaking. David reached out a hand, but Megan recoiled, taking a step back. He had known this was coming, the rejection, the anger, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. "I'm sorry, Megan," he said, his voice full of regret. "I can't undo the past, but I want to be here for you now. I want to be a part of your life. I want to make things right." Noah shook his head. "You can't just walk in and fix everything. David, it doesn't work like that," he said, his voice cold and distant. David's heart sank at the bitterness in Noah's words. He was right. It didn't work like that. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. The damage had been done, and now they had to face it together, as a family, if they even still could be. The silence in the room was deafening. David stood there, looking at each of them, feeling the distance growing between them. Even as he reached out, trying to bridge the gap, he wasn't sure how to fix this, how to make them understand. But he knew one thing for certain: the journey ahead would be more difficult than he had ever imagined. Then, just as David was about to speak again, the phone rang. It was a call from the charity event he had been planning for the last few months, pulling him back into the world of business and responsibility. The ringing of the phone felt like a cruel reminder that his life was split in two: the family he wanted to build and the career he had spent years constructing. He didn't want to answer it, but he had no choice. The moment he lifted the receiver, the silence in the room felt even heavier. The call, a simple request for his input on the charity's next steps, suddenly felt like an interruption he wasn't ready for. His eyes met the children's, and for a fleeting second, he saw the vulnerability in their faces. It was clear they didn't know how to process the truth he had just revealed. It wasn't something they could accept overnight, not with all the years of hurt and misunderstanding between them. As David listened to the voice on the other end of the line, his mind was miles away, with the children in the next room, struggling to comprehend a reality they weren't prepared for. The call ended, but David didn't feel relief. He had made a choice, and now the consequences were beginning to unfold. The hardest part, he realized, wasn't confronting the past. It was knowing that his family, the one he had hoped to build, was now at a crossroads. The truth had come out, but could they ever accept it? Could he make them see that he was trying to be the father they deserved? David Harrison's life felt like it was unraveling at a pace he couldn't control. The weight of his responsibilities at Harrison Enterprises seemed to grow heavier each day, and his attempts to bond with the children he had taken in felt like they were slipping through his fingers. The distance between them was palpable, and each attempt he made to bridge that gap only seemed to deepen the divide. Megan, Noah, Lily, and Joshua, all of them seemed so distant, each one struggling with their own silent battle. And in the midst of all of this, David could feel his own internal conflict eating away at him. He had made the choice to confront his past, to deal with the broken pieces of the relationship he had with Sophie Turner. But he realized that no matter how hard he tried, the pieces wouldn't fit together as easily as he had hoped. Sophie was gone. Her absence left a void in both his heart and the hearts of the children. But it wasn't just the absence of a mother, it was the unspoken weight of years of secrets and missed opportunities. Sophie had chosen to protect them from him, to shelter them from the reality of who their father was and what his life entailed. David couldn't forgive himself for that. And every time he looked at them, he was reminded of all that he had missed every birthday, every moment that could have been spent together. And yet, it wasn't just his own regret that stung. It was the resentment in their eyes, the uncertainty in their voices, the way they had begun to pull away from him. The truth had come out, but acceptance wasn't as simple as telling them the facts. It was about earning their trust, and that was something David had yet to achieve. One day, as the pressure mounted, David decided that something had to change. He couldn't keep running from his mistakes, and he couldn't keep fighting alone. If there was any chance of healing, of reconnecting with the children, he had to start from the beginning. He had to step outside of his comfort zone, beyond the walls of his corporate empire, and repair the damage he had done. He knew he had to reach out to the woman who had helped Sophie raise the children after they had been abandoned, Sophie's closest friend, Linda Montgomery. She had been a silent guardian, the woman who had offered support when Sophie was too afraid to ask for help. Linda had been a steady presence in the children's lives, someone they could depend on when the world seemed uncertain. David knew this wasn't going to be easy. Linda wasn't a fan of him, and rightfully so. She had watched him drift away from Sophie, watched him choose his career over the family he could have had. But this wasn't about him or her anymore. This was about making things right for the children. It wasn't going to be a quick fix, but he had to start somewhere. So, David picked up the phone and dialed the number he had known for years, but had avoided for far too long. The ringing on the other end felt like an eternity, each second stretching longer than the last. He had prepared himself for this moment in his mind, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure if he was ready. "Hello?" "David," came Linda's voice, warm but guarded. She had every reason to be. She knew how much damage had been done, knew that David's return to the children's lives wasn't as simple as offering an apology. "Linda, I don't know if you're still angry with me, but I need to talk to you," David began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I want to make things right. I owe it to Sophie, to the kids. I owe it to myself." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Linda responded. "What do you want?" "David, I need your help," he said quietly. "I want to do what Sophie would have wanted. I want to make sure the kids have everything they deserve. I can't fix the past, but I can start making things right now." Linda didn't answer right away. David could feel her considering his words, weighing the sincerity behind them. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, but still guarded. "You can't undo the past, David. You can't just walk back into their lives and expect everything to be okay." "I know," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "But I have to try. I have to give them the life they deserve." "I don't think it's about that anymore," Linda replied, her voice suddenly colder. "I think you need to give them what they're owed. David, not just your apology, but the truth. Everything." David sat back in his chair, stunned by the force of her words. He had come to ask for forgiveness, to make amends. But what Linda was saying was something deeper. It wasn't just about him being sorry. It was about the children reclaiming their place in this world. They didn't just deserve an apology. They deserved their rights, their legacy, the life that had been kept from them for so long. And David had a duty to help them reclaim that. No matter how hard it was for him, Linda, "I need to meet with you," David said, his resolve strengthening. "I need to know everything. Everything Sophie didn't tell me. I can't fix things without knowing the full truth." There was a long silence before Linda finally spoke again. "I'll meet you. But this isn't going to be easy, and you're not going to like everything I have to say." David nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "I understand. I'm ready to face whatever it takes." As the conversation ended, David sat in his office, the weight of the task ahead heavy on his shoulders. He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear everything Linda had to say, but he knew he had no choice. For the sake of the children, for the sake of his own redemption, he had to hear it. He had to face the reality of what Sophie had hidden from him all these years. David knew the journey ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he was determined to take the first step. He couldn't undo the past, but he could shape the future. The next morning, he received a message from Linda, a simple text that made his heart drop. "David, I need you to understand something. You don't need to apologize. Just give them what they deserve. That's all they've ever wanted from you." David stared at the text, his mind racing. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about making things right. And as he sat there, his mind already preparing for the painful truths that lay ahead, one thing became clear: he wasn't just fighting for forgiveness anymore. He was fighting for the children's future, for their right to know the truth, for their right to be whole. David stood in front of the window of his study, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The world outside was quiet, the evening air still, but within him, a storm of emotions raged. He had waited for so long, built his walls so high, yet here he was standing on the edge of something he could no longer avoid. The last few weeks had been a delicate dance between him and the children: Megan, Noah, Lily, and Joshua. Each one of them had changed in small but undeniable ways. It wasn't instantaneous. Nothing in this house had been. But the walls that once stood between them were beginning to crack. Slowly, they were letting him in, little by little, with shared memories and cautious laughter. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something more than he had ever dared to hope for. Megan had started to smile again, a smile that wasn't just polite or forced. When she told him about her day, there was a lightness to her voice that had been absent for so long. Lily and Joshua, though still shy, had begun to ask him questions about his work, his past, about life. Noah, quiet and thoughtful as ever, had begun to open up in small bursts, sharing stories about their mother, Sophie. It was as if the children were testing the waters, unsure but willing to try. The silence between them no longer felt like an abyss, but David knew better than to think this was the end of the journey. Forgiveness wasn't a switch that could be flipped. He saw the skepticism in their eyes, the unspoken doubt that still lingered in the corners of the room whenever he spoke of the past. They wanted answers. They wanted to know why he had stayed away for so long, why their mother had kept them from him. They wanted to know if he was going to keep his promises this time. David couldn't blame them. He had made promises before, and he had broken them. They had every right to question him, every right to keep their distance until they were certain he wouldn't disappear again. He understood that, but it didn't make it any easier. He had spent his life building an empire, climbing higher and higher in the world of business, believing that success could fill the empty spaces in his heart, but it hadn't. And now, the empty spaces felt so much bigger. The children didn't need his wealth or his power. They didn't need a father who could provide a fancy house or expensive vacations. They needed a father who had been there when it mattered, and David had failed them. He had failed Sophie, too, by not being there when she needed him most. But that was in the past, and while the past could never be erased, David knew that he couldn't keep living in the shadow of his mistakes. The children had given him a chance to do better. It was more than he deserved, but he couldn't waste it. One evening, after dinner, David sat with them in the living room. It was the first time they had all gathered together since the night he had revealed the truth about their mother's death. The tension was still there, but there was something else now, an unspoken understanding, a fragile hope. He looked at each of them, his gaze lingering a moment longer on Noah. The young boy was the one who reminded him so much of Sophie, There was a softness in Noah's eyes, a hint of sadness that seemed to carry a weight David couldn't even begin to understand. But there was also a quiet strength, a resilience that made David admire him more than words could express. "Can we talk?" David asked, his voice steady but filled with emotion. The children nodded, unsure of what to expect. David cleared his throat, his mind searching for the right words. "I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I know I've failed you before, and I know that nothing I say can change the past. But I'm here now, and I'll be here for as long as you'll let me." Megan looked at him with those familiar, guarded eyes. Why now? Why, after all these years? David swallowed hard. The truth was simple, but hard to say. "I can't undo the past. Megan, I can't give you back the years I missed, but I can show you that I'm not the same man I was, and I'm not leaving you. Not again." The room was silent for a long moment. David waited, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know if they would accept his words, if they would believe him. He didn't know if he could even believe them himself. Noah was the first to speak. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Do you really think we can just forget?" David shook his head. "No, I don't think you can forget. I don't think you should, but I think we can start fresh. I think we can move forward, together." There was another long silence. Lily and Joshua exchanged glances, their faces still uncertain. But Megan, always the cautious one, looked up at David, her eyes searching his face for something she could trust. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Megan said softly, "but I'm willing to try." David felt a weight lift off his shoulders, though it was only temporary. He knew that their journey wasn't over. It would take time, effort, and understanding. But hearing Megan's words, seeing the flicker of hope in her eyes, it meant more than he could express. The children's forgiveness would not come easily, and it certainly wouldn't be quick. But they had given him a chance, and that was all he needed. Later that night, as David lay in bed, he felt the weight of the day on his shoulders. The conversation with the children had not been easy. He had said the words he needed to say, but it hadn't been enough to heal the wounds. Not yet. But it was a start, and that was all he could do. David closed his eyes, a sense of exhaustion settling over him. But as he drifted off to sleep, he held on to a fragile hope, a hope that one day he would earn their trust. That one day, they would see the man he had become and not just the man he had been. And as the silence filled the room, one thought lingered in his mind. "I can't undo the past, but I can make the future better, for them, for me, for all of us." David stood at the edge of the construction site, his hands buried deep in his pockets as he surveyed the scene before him. The once empty lot had transformed into something extraordinary. Tall metal fences were being erected, wooden beams were being stacked neatly in rows, and blueprints were spread across the makeshift tables. The project, which had started as a mere idea, was now taking shape before his eyes. He had always been a man of business, a man who could maneuver through financial markets, strike deals, and oversee multi-million-dollar projects. But this was different. This was real work, something tangible, something that could actually change lives. And for the first time in his life, David felt a strange peace settle in his chest. The weight of his past mistakes, the guilt that had haunted him for so long, didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. It was all because of the children. Megan, Noah, Lily, and Joshua. Each of them had thrown themselves into the project with a passion that David could hardly comprehend. They were the ones who had pushed him to do this, to create something for other kids like them. He had no idea what he was doing at first, but the more he saw the way they interacted with the other kids, the way their faces lit up when they spoke about helping others, the more he realized that he wasn't just doing this for them, he was doing it for himself, too. They had become his family in ways he couldn't put into words. The walls he had built around himself were finally starting to crumble, and as they worked together, he began to see something different in the kids. They were no longer the children who resented him. They were no longer the children who looked at him with distrust. They were becoming the children he had always wanted them to be: strong, kind, and capable of making a difference in the world. But David knew that they weren't the only ones who were changing. He could feel the shift in himself, too. The world he had built, the one of wealth and success, had always been about competition. It had been about winning, about being the best, about doing everything for his own benefit. But now he understood what it meant to do something for the good of others. "Hey, Mr. Ethan," Joshua called, interrupting his thoughts. "When do you think the others will show up?" David blinked, looking over to see Joshua's excited face. It was the first time David had heard the kids refer to him as Mr. Ethan. It felt odd at first, but in a way, it made sense. They were starting to see him in a different light. They weren't just looking to him as a provider or a guardian anymore. They were starting to see him as someone who cared about their well-being. "Soon," David said, smiling at Joshua. "They'll be here in a few minutes." The kids had been working hard over the last few weeks, planning the community center, organizing the activities, and raising awareness for the cause. But the real turning point had come when they decided to bring the other kids into the fold. They wanted to help those who had been abandoned or forgotten, those who were stuck in the same situations they had once found themselves in. It wasn't just about building something. It was about making a real impact on lives. David had never imagined himself in this role. He had always been the one to call the shots from behind a desk, making decisions that affected the lives of others without ever really understanding the true consequences. But now, standing with these kids, watching them work together toward a common goal, David realized that this was what he had been missing all along. The sound of laughter filled the air as Megan and Lily walked over to him, their arms full of supplies. "We got everything we need for the next phase," Megan said, her voice full of pride. She had become a leader of sorts in this project, and David couldn't help but feel a swell of pride for her. "That's great," David replied, nodding. "You all are doing amazing work." Megan smiled at him, her eyes softening. It was moments like this that reminded David how far they had come. Just a few months ago, she had been cold, distant, unwilling to trust him. Now, she was working alongside him, building something for others. It was a small step, but it was one that meant more to him than anything he had ever accomplished in his career. As the kids continued to work, David felt a sense of fulfillment he had never experienced before. This was what life was about: helping others, making a difference, being a part of something bigger than himself. And he could see that the kids had already grasped that lesson. They were changing the world in their own way, and David couldn't be prouder. As the day went on, more and more people began to show up. Neighbors, volunteers, and local businesses all came to lend a hand. It was incredible to see the community coming together for a cause that mattered. And as David watched the workers organize the area, he couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. This was his chance to make things right, not just for the kids, but for himself, too. However, as the sun began to set and the site began to empty out, David was left standing alone, looking over the progress they had made. His thoughts drifted to Sophie. He knew that she would have been proud of what they had accomplished, proud of how far the kids had come, but the thought of her brought an ache to his chest. He hadn't been able to undo the mistakes of the past. He couldn't bring her back, but he could make things right with her children. He felt a deep sadness as he thought about all the years they had lost, all the things they could have shared together. He could never get those years back, but what he could do was make the most of the time he had left, and that was exactly what he was going to do. The sound of a soft voice brought him back to the present. It was Megan again. "Mr. Ethan, we've got a lot of work left to do, don't we?" David smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "Yes, Megan, we do, but we're doing it together." And in that moment, David knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the backyard as the children laughed and played together. The sound of their joy filled the air, and David couldn't help but watch them, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Just a few months ago, this moment would have seemed impossible. His life was dominated by work, and the thought of being a father, a real father, seemed like an unattainable dream. But now, here they were, Megan, Noah, Lily, and Joshua, each of them contributing their unique energy to the space they had created together. David had always been a man of logic, of order, of clear plans, but nothing had prepared him for the unpredictable nature of fatherhood, for the deep emotional bonds that formed silently through little moments that went unnoticed by most. Moments like this one, when he stood there watching the children play, realizing just how far they had come, and how far he had come, too. It had been weeks since the children had started to warm to him, to trust him in ways that felt real. They had all opened up to him slowly, each sharing fragments of their lives, their fears, their hopes. But despite all of this progress, David still felt that there was a gap, a space between them that he couldn't quite bridge. No matter how much he did for them, no matter how much time he spent with them, there was always a lingering thought in the back of his mind. Am I truly their father? Do they truly see me as one? As he stood in the yard, deep in thought, Noah's voice broke through his reverie. The young boy had run up to him, his face flushed from running, his clothes a little dirt-streaked from the rough-and-tumble play. Mr. Ethan, can you help me with this? Noah's eyes were wide with concern as he handed David a broken toy car. The boy had an anxious look on his face, as though the world would end if the car couldn't be fixed. David smiled and kneeled down to examine the toy. Let me take a look. Noah, I'm sure I can fix it. He took the car from Noah's hands, and as he started tinkering with it, he felt a small hand rest gently on his shoulder. It was then that the unexpected happened. Thanks. Dad, Noah said quietly. David froze. His hands stopped moving. His breath caught in his throat. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Noah hadn't said Mr. Ethan or even David. He had said Dad. The word echoed in David's mind as though it had just cracked open something inside him. He looked up at Noah, his face filled with a mixture of confusion and hope, his heart racing. The words hung between them, and for a moment, David couldn't speak. He hadn't expected this. Not so soon. Not with all the history, all the unresolved emotions that still lingered between him and the children. But here it was, an unspoken acceptance, a bridge between them. Noah wasn't looking at him for affirmation, though. He was simply watching him, waiting for him to fix the car, completely unaware of the weight his words had carried. It was as if he hadn't realized that what he had just said had shifted something inside David. The child didn't know how much this one word had changed everything. David looked at Noah for a long moment before a soft smile spread across his face. You're welcome, buddy, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He continued to work on the toy car, but inside, he was struggling to maintain control. His hands were trembling slightly as he made small adjustments to the toy, knowing that Noah had unknowingly just given him something precious, a piece of his heart, a trust that David had longed for but never expected to find. As David fixed the car, Megan approached, her gaze softening as she observed the scene. She stood beside him for a moment, then spoke, her voice low but steady. He trusts you, she said, her words carrying more weight than she probably realized. David looked up at her, his heart swelling with a mixture of joy and guilt. Do you think he really does? Megan nodded slowly, her arms crossed in front of her as she leaned against the porch railing. Yeah, I think we all do. We didn't really have a father, you know, but you've been there for us, even when we didn't want you to be. She paused, her eyes momentarily flickering away before meeting his again. I think we're finally starting to realize you're not just here because you have to be. You're here because you want to be. David felt a lump form in his throat, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't have words. It was hard to explain the flood of emotions he was feeling in that moment. The ache in his chest, the longing for everything he had missed, the deep desire to be everything they needed him to be. You know, I'm not perfect, David said after a long pause, his voice quiet but steady. And I've made a lot of mistakes. But I'm here. I'm here for you. And I will be, no matter what. Megan's face softened as she stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. We know, she said gently. We know. Just then, Lily and Joshua joined them, their faces lighting up as they saw Noah's toy car back in one piece. Thanks, Mr. Ethan, Lily said with a smile, her eyes gleaming with excitement. You're the best. David felt a rush of warmth at the sight of them, and he couldn't help but smile. It was as if, in that one moment, everything had clicked into place. They were beginning to see him not just as a caretaker or a guardian, but as someone they could rely on, someone who had earned a place in their lives. And for David, that was everything. The day continued, and as the sun began to set, casting a soft golden hue over the yard, David sat on the porch with the children, each of them talking animatedly about their plans for the next steps in the community project. The sounds of laughter, of conversation, of life filled the air around them. But as David listened, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. They had all come so far, and despite the pain and the struggles, they were finally starting to heal. As the night drew in, the last of the sunlight fading over the horizon, David realized that this was what it meant to be a father. Not the grand gestures, not the perfect moments, but the simple, quiet moments of connection. The trust that had been built in small, unspoken ways. And in that moment, as the stars began to twinkle in the sky, David knew that he had truly found his place, not just in their lives, but in the world. He wasn't just the man who had made mistakes. He wasn't just the man who had been given a second chance. He was their father, and they were his children, and that was enough. The boardroom was a large, cold, and imposing space on the top floor of Harrison Enterprises. The walls were lined with polished wood, the glass windows offering a breathtaking view of the city. But as David sat at the head of the table, he couldn't help but feel trapped. The view that once made him feel like a man on top of the world now felt distant, as if a wall was rising between him and everything he had worked so hard to build. The room, filled with the powerful and influential, was now a battleground. David had expected this to happen eventually. The tension had been mounting for weeks, ever since he started getting closer to the children. It wasn't just the staff at Harrison Enterprises who were questioning his actions. It was his own family, his colleagues, and those who had once admired him. The whispers had started, subtle at first, but now they were undeniable. He had strayed from the path they all knew him to walk. David, Jonathan Green, a senior partner at the company, began, his voice dripping with concern, but also a hint of disdain. You're a man of influence. Your decisions affect the company. I've always respected your work, but this is a distraction. Bringing those children into your life, it's not only reckless, but it's also damaging to the reputation of this company. David's jaw clenched, but he remained calm. He had heard these words before from other people, in other settings. He had known this moment would come, the moment when his personal life would be thrust into the spotlight, and his choices would be scrutinized by those who saw him as nothing more than an asset to their bottom line. I understand your concern, Jonathan, David replied, his voice steady, but there was a tightness in his chest. But I don't think you see the bigger picture here. You're a man with a legacy. David, interrupted another board member, a woman named Claire, who had been quiet until now. Don't you see what's happening? You're going down a path that will ruin the reputation you've built. You can't have it both ways. You can't play family man and corporate titan. It's one or the other. David's heart raced as he listened to the voices around the table. It wasn't just the board members, it was his family, too. They had been worried. His brother had called him twice in the past week, urging him to reconsider the direction he was taking with his life. Even his father, who had always been a stoic figure, had voiced his concerns. They all saw this as a threat to everything David had worked for, the children, the messy, complicated love he was beginning to feel for them. It all seemed to them like an inconvenient disruption. But for David, it wasn't just about the children. It was about something far deeper, a need to reconcile the man he had been with, the man he was becoming. He had spent so many years building this empire, chasing after success, only to realize that it meant little without a purpose to anchor it. The children had given him that purpose. They had awakened something in him that he had forgotten, a sense of responsibility, of love, of belonging. But in doing so, they had also torn him between two worlds. He looked around the table at the faces of the people he had worked with for years, people who had been by his side when things were good, but who now seemed ready to turn away because of his personal choices. He had never felt so alone. The weight of their disapproval pressed down on him, suffocating. As the voices of the board members rose, David's mind began to race. He knew what they wanted from him: conformity. They wanted him to choose the company, to leave the messy business of family and responsibility behind, but he wasn't sure if he could do that anymore. He had changed, and maybe the world around him hadn't noticed, but he couldn't ignore the pull he felt toward those children. They weren't just a distraction, they were his redemption. Jonathan continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. You're already overextended. David, do you really think you can balance your career with this? You're losing focus. And if you don't get a hold of this, it could be the end of everything. David sat in silence for a moment, the words hanging in the air like a cloud ready to burst. The tension in the room was palpable, but David had reached his breaking point. The choice wasn't just about career or family. It was about the kind of man he wanted to be. David took a deep breath, standing up slowly, his eyes never leaving Jonathan's. The room fell quiet, everyone watching him, waiting for his response. I'm not choosing, he said, his voice firm, louder than he had intended. I'm not choosing between my family and my career. I'm not going to abandon what I've worked for, but I'm also not going to turn my back on what matters most to me. I've spent too many years chasing after things that didn't make me happy. It's time for something different. I'll rebuild everything if I have to. This is who I am now. The room fell into a stunned silence. David could feel the weight of his words in the air, heavy and final. He had said it. He had made his stand, and there was no going back. Claire, who had been so adamant earlier, now looked at him with something resembling doubt, though she tried to hide it behind a mask of professionalism. You're willing to risk it all. David, she asked, the words carrying an edge of disbelief. I'm willing to risk everything, David replied. I've already lost too much to keep pretending that I can have it all without the things that truly matter. I can't live for other people's expectations anymore. I have to live for what I believe in. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the boardroom, meeting the eyes of each member. And if that's not enough for you, then I'll walk away from it all. I won't let my family suffer for the sake of this company. As he finished speaking, the weight of the decision settled into his bones, and the silence in the room felt deafening. He stood there, waiting. As the board members exchanged glances, his mind raced, but his heart knew that he had made the right choice. Jonathan opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. David could see the hesitation, the uncertainty in his eyes. He knew that this wasn't just about business anymore. It was about something deeper, something more important. The door to the meeting room opened then, and in walked Lily and Noah. They had come in from the company event downstairs, where they had been with the other children. Their faces were tired but bright, full of the innocent joy that only children could possess. They looked at David, and their eyes softened. For a moment, everything else disappeared: the boardroom, the board members, the pressure. It was just David and the children, the family he had been striving for. Are we done? Noah asked, his voice breaking through the tension. David smiled at him, his heart swelling with affection. Almost, kid, he replied, his voice a little shaky. Almost. As Noah and Lily walked toward him, David realized that no matter what happened next, he had already made his choice. He was ready to fight for his family, for them, no matter the cost. David sat in his office, looking out the large windows that overlooked the bustling streets of New York. The city felt like it was constantly moving, but for him, things had slowed down. He could see the cranes working on new buildings, the people walking briskly down the sidewalks, their lives intersecting in countless ways. His own life had shifted, too, in a way he hadn't expected. The boardroom meetings, the corporate presentations, the endless flow of emails and conference calls, they all still existed. But now, they didn't consume him the way they once had. His mind had drifted from profits and mergers to something deeper, something more meaningful. It was about purpose, about creating something that mattered, not just for him, but for others. And it had started with those children. When David first met them, the kids were broken, distrustful, and lost. They had no place to call home, and he had no idea how much of a responsibility he was taking on when he decided to become their guardian. He thought it would be about providing for them, about being the father figure they so desperately needed. But what he hadn't realized was that the experience would transform him, change him in ways he never expected. He wasn't just a man with a reputation to maintain anymore. He wasn't just the CEO of Harrison Enterprises. He was a man learning to be a father, a man who realized that true strength came not from his business acumen, but from his ability to care for others, to step out of his comfort zone and make a difference. And that difference didn't come from giving away money. It came from giving time, from investing himself in a future that didn't just belong to him. The children had changed him, but now he needed to show the world that he wasn't just changing for them, he was changing for himself, and he was going to prove it with action. He had started the community project months ago, a small initiative to help orphaned children and families who had nowhere to turn. But it wasn't enough to just offer charity. David wanted to give people a chance, a real shot at something better. He wanted to create a sustainable change, to offer education, job opportunities, and most of all, hope. So he expanded the project, launching a scholarship fund for children from underprivileged backgrounds and starting outreach programs to help struggling families. It wasn't about making headlines or securing another business deal. It was about giving others the chance to build something they could be proud of, just as he had done. David knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be opposition, but he was prepared to face it head on. This was bigger than anything he had done before. This was his true calling. The first few months had been a blur of meetings, fundraising, and outreach. It was hard work, exhausting even. But every time he saw a child smile or heard a story of someone whose life had improved, it fueled him to keep going. He had spoken at countless events, but the most moving moments were those when he saw the direct impact of the work. The kids who had once been without hope, now speaking about their dreams for the future. It made everything else seem insignificant in comparison. But as the project grew, so did the pressure. The board members, who had been so focused on their bottom line, now saw the changes David was making in the community. And while some supported him, others were growing increasingly frustrated. "You're diverting attention away from the company's priorities," Jonathan Green, the senior board member, had said during a meeting. "Your personal life is becoming too entangled with your professional one. This charity work is admirable, David, but it's a distraction. We need you focused on Harrison Enterprises." David had heard these complaints before. He knew the stakes, but this time, he wasn't backing down. He understood now that the true measure of success wasn't how much money he had in the bank or how much power he wielded. It was about what he left behind, what he gave to the world. His family, too, had begun to notice the changes in him. His brother, Andrew, who had always been the practical one, had quietly acknowledged that David was making a difference. "I'm proud of you, David," he had said one night, after the two of them had spent hours working on the project's development. "I never thought I'd hear that from myself, but I'm proud of you." The children had noticed it too. Megan, who had once been distant, had started to warm up to him, even asking questions about his work. Lily, who had been so unsure of David at first, was now helping him plan the next steps of their community outreach. Noah, always the quiet one, had grown comfortable enough to call him Dad without hesitation. It wasn't just a word. It was a sign that they were building something real, something that went beyond mere obligation. One day, as David was walking through the halls of the new community center, He overheard one of the workers telling a mother of three how the scholarship fund had changed their lives. The woman had been on the brink of giving up, unsure of how to afford school supplies or tuition for her children. Now, thanks to David's work, she was able to send her kids to a better school, and she had even enrolled in college herself. David stopped in his tracks, feeling a lump form in his throat. This was what he had been striving for, real change, not just the kind that looked good on paper, but the kind that truly helped people. He couldn't have done it without them. The children who had brought him back to life, the team of workers who believed in the cause, the donors who had trusted him. He hadn't just rebuilt a company, he had rebuilt his soul, and that was worth more than any fortune. Yet, even with all the success and progress, David felt a nagging doubt. Despite everything he had accomplished, there was still a part of him that wondered if it was enough. Had he truly earned the right to be called a father, a man worthy of the children's love and trust? He wasn't sure. That afternoon, as he sat at his desk in the office, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Lily. "Dad, I don't know when I started believing in you, but I believe in you now. I hope you know that." David stared at the screen for a moment, a tear slipping down his cheek. He had always been the man who believed in results, in the tangible things he could control. But this was something different. This was trust. This was love. And this, he realized, was what mattered most. As he prepared to speak at the upcoming fundraiser, a crowd of supporters and community leaders gathered. David stood in front of the podium. His thoughts were interrupted by a ringing phone. The name on the screen read, Harrison Enterprises Board of Directors. He looked at the phone for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. It was then that he made a decision. "I don't need the fame," David muttered to himself. "I just want to be part of her world." David stood at the center of the community exhibition hall, surrounded by the lively buzz of children, families, and volunteers. The air was thick with the kind of warmth that only a gathering of people who shared a purpose could bring. He watched as his kids, Noah, Megan, Lily, and Joshua, interacted with the visitors, their laughter filling the space with an infectious joy. This wasn't just any event. It was the culmination of months of hard work, a project born from David's desire to make a real difference. And yet, for him, it was so much more. He had once walked through life feeling empty, disconnected from his own heart, from those around him. The endless days of meetings, numbers, and business strategies had filled the void, but it was always an illusion, a temporary satisfaction that could never sustain him. The connection he now shared with these children, the children he had come to call his own, had restored a sense of completeness he had long lost. In their eyes, he saw the love he had yearned for and had been too afraid to believe in. They were no longer just children he had taken in, they were his family. The exhibit featured paintings, photographs, and drawings from local kids, a celebration of their creativity, their voices. David had always believed in the power of art to inspire change, but seeing it firsthand in the smiles of the children he now cared for, he understood the depth of its impact. Each piece told a story. Each brushstroke was a reflection of a life that had been touched by something more than just charity. It had been touched by love and trust. As he moved through the crowd, he overheard a group of people asking about the absence of Teacher Blake, a nickname his kids had given him as a sign of affection. David smiled quietly to himself. It had taken time, but the kids had embraced him as one of their own. They had come to rely on him, not just for what he could provide, but for the support and love he gave them every day. The idea that someone could come into their lives and offer more than just material things was a concept they were slowly beginning to understand. And through their acceptance, David realized he had found a sense of belonging he'd never known before. He looked across the room, seeing them standing in the corner, laughing, their eyes lighting up as they interacted with other kids. Megan was talking to a younger girl about the upcoming school play. Noah, though still reserved, was talking to a boy his age, his usually distant expression replaced with something like hope. Lily and Joshua were holding hands, their joy undeniable. They were no longer strangers to one another. They were a family, a unit, bound not by blood, but by shared experiences, struggles, and triumphs. David's heart swelled as he observed the children. He realized, with a profound sense of peace, that the life he had once built was nothing compared to this. The connection with these children, the genuine bond they shared, the trust they had placed in him, was the life he had always been searching for. All the wealth, the power, the success had felt like nothing but fleeting moments of satisfaction. But now, he had something real, something that would last. This was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. A soft hand rested on his shoulder. David turned to see Andrew, his brother, standing beside him. There was no need for words. Andrew's expression said it all. A simple, quiet acknowledgement of everything David had done, everything he had become. "I'm proud of you," Andrew said, his voice quiet but steady. David didn't know how to respond. The words felt too simple for the depth of the emotions he was feeling. Instead, he just nodded, looking back at the children. This was the recognition he had always sought, not in grand gestures or public applause, but in the quiet, understanding moments like these. Moments where the world knew what he had done, and more importantly, where he knew what he had done for himself, for his family. As the day drew to a close, the room began to empty, and the children gathered around David. Lily was the first to approach him, her hand tugging gently at his sleeve. She handed him something small wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" David asked, his voice soft with curiosity. Lily smiled up at him, her eyes sparkling with pride. "It's from all of us," she said, her voice full of a quiet but heartfelt sincerity. "We wanted to give you something for everything you've done." David unwrapped the paper carefully. Inside was a small sculpture of a dancer, made of clay and paint, capturing the delicate grace of movement frozen in time. The shape was simple, yet it held a deep sense of emotion, a reminder of the beauty that could be created even from humble beginnings. It was a reflection of how far they had all come together. "This is beautiful," David whispered, overcome with emotion. He looked at the sculpture and then back at his children. "I'll keep this forever," he promised. Megan, who had been listening nearby, added softly, "You've always been there for us. We'll always be here for you too." David couldn't hold back the tears now. The room was quiet, the weight of those words settling on him. For so long, he had lived his life striving for perfection, for success, for the next big achievement. But now, he realized, the greatest achievement was the family he had built with love and care. The greatest success was finding peace in his own heart. As the final guest departed and the lights dimmed, David stood silently, his gaze locked on the sculpture in his hands. It was a simple gift, but it symbolized everything he had worked for, everything he had become. He didn't need the praise of the world. He didn't need a title or an award. What he had now was more valuable than anything else. A family that had chosen him, a purpose that gave him meaning, and the deep satisfaction of knowing he was no longer just a man of wealth, but a man of heart. He took one last look around the hall, his eyes lingering on the children as they headed out the door, their laughter echoing in the hallway. And then he whispered to himself, "They don't need to be the same to be together. They just need to look in the same direction." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, David sat quietly on the porch, watching his children play. They were no longer the strangers who once haunted his thoughts, but a part of him now, a family in the truest sense. He didn't need to speak to understand the bond they shared. Sometimes, just being there, without saying a word, was enough. The world didn't change overnight, and neither did they. But small moments, like this one, built something deeper than what any grand gesture could offer. And maybe, in the end, that's where real change happens, not in the dramatic moments, but in the quiet persistence of everyday life. As he looked at them, he wondered, what does it really mean to be family? And in that question, he found peace.